12-year-old boy, one lie, and 3 death sentences. In broad daylight, acid splashes across a man's face. His scream tears through the quiet streets of 1975 Cleveland. No physical evidence, no weapon, no DNA. Just one voice, one child's voice. And nearly 4 decades later, from a hospital bed, that voice, now grown, breaks in a whisper. I don't want to die with this lie. The story you're about to witness isn't just about wrongful convictions. It's about a stolen life, an abandoned conscience, and a truth buried for decades, waiting to breathe again. If you want more powerful, haunting, and deeply human stories like this, hit that subscribe button now, so you don't miss a single film we bring to light. The first sound was silence, too clean, too still, like the breath held just before something terrible. Then came the hiss. A cup sailed through the heavy Cleveland air. Its contents a clear, burning liquid smashed against the face of a man in a neat gray suit. For a moment he froze. It was as if his brain hadn't yet caught up with his body. Then he screamed. It was a sound no human should ever make, high-pitched, ragged, and filled with a pain that split the air. He stumbled backwards, clawing at his face as it began to blister and bubble. His briefcase flew from his hand, bursting open on the pavement, money orders, forms, envelopes fluttering out in chaos. 2 figures closed in. One lifted a metal pipe. The other drew a gun. The pipe came down. Once, twice. The gun fired once, then again. Glass shattered. A woman screamed from inside the store. Then stillness. East Cleveland, May 1975. A man had just been murdered in broad daylight. Not in the shadows, not in the night, but under the open sky as kids rode their bikes and neighbors watered their lawns. Was it just a robbery or something darker? Karen was 16 that day. She'd just stepped off the bus when she saw them 2 boys leaning against the storefront of Robinson's Grocery. She didn't know them. Didn't want to. They made crude remarks as she walked past. She kept her head down. Didn't respond. She remembers their faces even now. Inside the store felt familiar. Mrs. Robinson was chatting with a customer, a man in his late 50s with a kind face and a worn leather briefcase. Harry Franks. He'd been walking this route for years, selling money orders. Everyone knew him, trusted him. He gave her a small nod, said something polite, and stepped outside. 30 seconds later, everything changed. Karen heard it. A scuffle, then a sharp crack like a firework exploding too close. Then screaming. She ran to the front window. She saw the men, the acid, the blows, the gunshots. Mr. Franks collapsing to the sidewalk, his body twitching. One of them grabbed the briefcase. Then they were gone. Mrs. Robinson screamed, "Oh my God, they're shooting." She turned. Blood was already soaking through her blouse. "I've been shot," she cried, stumbling into the store, collapsing in a pool of red. Karen stood frozen. The only sounds were gurgling, shallow breaths. She would later say, "I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I couldn't." His body was in front of the door. I had to step over his head just to get out. Outside, the street erupted. Sirens, yelling. A crowd began to gather. Harry Franks was dead. Burned, beaten, shot. The sidewalk beneath him told the story. The papers from his briefcase soaked through with blood. From a distance, a school bus idled behind the commotion. Inside, a 12-year-old boy leaned against the window, watching it all unfold. His face unreadable, his eyes wide. His name was Eddie Vernon, and in the quiet stillness of his seat, he whispered the sentence that would change everything. I know who did it. He was just 12. Eddie Vernon walked into the East Cleveland police station alone. His sneakers still dusted from the sidewalk outside, his face tense with something he couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or something deeper. Something clawing at his insides since the moment he saw the blood on the ground and the stillness of Mr. Franks's body. An officer leaned down, voice low. "Hon, you said you know who did this." Eddie nodded. He didn't stammer. He didn't cry. He raised his hand and pointed. Ricky, Ronnie, and why. The room changed. The detectives looked at each other. One of them muttered something under his breath. They asked him to say it again. He did, and just like that, 3 names, 3 lives were locked in. The next morning before sunrise, they moved in. 25 officers in riot gear, shotguns, pistols, body armor. They surrounded a modest home on the east side, where Ricky Jackson was still asleep in his bed. A flashlight beam hit his eyes before they even registered the sound of boots on the floorboards. Someone grabbed his leg, shook him. He opened his eyes and saw guns, black barrels, flashing lights, voices screaming over each other. Hands up, face down, don't move. Down the block they hit the Bridgman house next. Ronnie and Y brothers pulled from their sleep into chaos. Their mother tried to step in, was shoved aside. Ronnie didn't resist. Y shouted something about not understanding what the hell was going on. None of them knew, not really. They hadn't even heard about the murder yet. In the official police report, Eddie Vernon was described as credible, clear-headed, and unshakable. A bright 7th grader. Polite, talkative. The kind of kid who delivered newspapers with a smile, said thank you at the door, remembered names. He'd told the police that he saw the crime from his school bus, that he'd seen the 3 boys, Ricky, Ronnie, and Y, attack Mr. Franks, that he'd watched from the window as the gun went off and the briefcase was stolen. When the officers asked for more, Eddie didn't hesitate. He got in the cruiser, drove with them, pointed out each boy's house one by one. The police drew up search warrants, raided the homes, tore through bedrooms and closets, drawers and garbage bins. They were looking for anything: clothes, a weapon, a trace of acid. They found nothing. No blood, no briefcase, no gun, no pipe, no matching clothing, nothing. Only Eddie's word. It didn't matter. The press caught wind of the arrest. 3 black teens, armed robbery, acid, murder. The story wrote itself. TV cameras rolled as officers led the boys handcuffed out of their homes. Neighbors stood in doorways, confused, shocked. Some angry, some just silent. Inside the precinct, the air was stale and electric. Ricky sat handcuffed to a bench, staring at the floor. Ronnie asked for a lawyer. Y paced, jaw clenched, repeating that none of this made sense. They hadn't been near Robinson's store that day. They had alibis, witnesses. No one cared. The narrative had already been built, and the boy who gave it, Eddie Vernon, was at the center of it all. They called him back in, asked him to view a lineup. 6 men stood under the fluorescent lights. Eddie froze. He didn't say anything. The officers wrote that he seemed scared, that he was hesitant. Then finally he signed a statement. A full written declaration that he had seen Ricky Jackson, Ronnie Bridgman, and Wichelle Bridgman commit the murder of Harry Franks. He gave them everything they needed to press charges for capital murder. Outside the interrogation rooms, the narrative was simpler. The police had their men. The city could exhale. A brutal daylight murder had been solved in less than a week. But behind the closed doors of those cells, the truth was slipping through the cracks. In another part of town, people were talking. The Jacksons weren't troublemakers. The Bridgman boys were well-known, quiet, respectful, always helping their mom at church, always coming home on time. They weren't gangsters. They weren't known to the police. There were no records, no priors. They were kids. Ricky had just turned 18. Ronnie was 20. Y was 17. One moment they were preparing for graduation. The next they were sitting in cold rooms, being asked how they killed a man they hadn't even seen. Across the city, a quiet tension spread. People whispered in barber shops and stoops. Some believed the boys were guilty. Others didn't. But everyone felt the same chill: this case was moving too fast. The details didn't add up. No physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no motive. Just one voice, a child's voice. And in court, that voice would echo louder than facts. It would outweigh reason. It would override truth. But no one knew that yet. Inside that police station, Eddie Vernon sat in a stiff chair, staring straight ahead. He didn't blink. He didn't ask to go home. He simply said, "I saw them do it." And with that, the trap closed. No alarms, no last-minute confessions, no one asking, what if? Only handcuffs, only headlines, and a silence that would last almost 40 years, under a faded seal of the state of Ohio, in a courtroom that smelled faintly of wood polish and sweat. 3 young men sat separately on different days under different judges, but bound by the same chain of accusation. Ronnie Bridgman, Wichelle Bridgman, Ricky Jackson. Each of them faced a jury, 12 strangers, all white. And each time it was the same charge: aggravated murder, the same penalty: death. They were tried separately, as if splitting them would somehow separate the truth. But the prosecution's case, thin as thread, was stitched together by one consistent voice, a 12-year-old boy named Eddie Vernon. Each time he took the stand, clean clothes, nervous hands, voice trembling but clear. He told the same story he saw it all from the school bus window. He saw the men, their faces, their movements, the gun, the fall, the briefcase. He pointed, he repeated. He swore under oath. And the courtroom believed him. In Ricky Jackson's trial, a woman named Karen Smith took the stand. She was poised, honest, calm. She testified that she saw the attack, that the faces Eddie claimed to recognize were not the faces she remembered, that she was there and he wasn't. She was a defense witness, a young black woman. She wasn't rude or unsure. She was clear, composed, but she was dismissed. The prosecutor leaned into his closing arguments. We have a reliable child witness, one with no agenda, just a boy doing the right thing. And this community, your community, was torn apart by the murder of Mr. Franks. The law demands justice. The word justice rang out like a verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty. When the verdict was read, Ricky didn't move. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm. He barely flinched. A woman in the second row. His mother let out a sharp, involuntary cry. Her knees buckled. She collapsed into the arms of her sister. The judge didn't even look up. The next trial followed the same pattern. Same tone. Same evidence, just Eddie's voice and the lack of any physical proof painted as irrelevance. Sometimes the prosecutor said a case rests on the courage of a single child. And today that courage speaks louder than doubt. The jury agreed. Guilty. Then why the youngest? He was 17. The courtroom lights seemed harsher that day. Or maybe it was the way he squinted when the sentence was read. A boy in an oversized suit trying to sit like a man while his future was being buried alive. Outside, a photographer captured the moment Y's father leaned against the courthouse wall. Face in his hands, a silent scream caught behind clenched teeth. Inside, Y was sentenced to death. 3 young men, 3 death sentences. The system worked like clockwork. No hung juries, no mistrials, no hesitations. Eddie Vernon sat quietly in the back row of one of the courtrooms. He didn't clap. He didn't cry. But in an interview years later, he would say, I was just a witness. But when they were sentenced to die, I knew I had done something wrong. The moment the final sentence was read, the courtroom emptied like a theater closing its last act. Lawyers packed their bags. Reporters filed stories. The guards led Ricky, Ronnie, and Y through a door that would close behind them for decades, down a corridor, into transport vans, to holding cells, and eventually to death row. The state moved quickly. The prison began preparing. Each man was assigned a number, a bunk, a box for their few belongings. And somewhere in a dim concrete room inside Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, a technician began checking the straps and wiring on the electric chair Old Sparky. It sat there, silent, waiting. Steel, wood, leather. It had no opinion, no conscience, just a switch, and the power to turn breath into silence. And for 3 boys, 3 innocent boys, it was already humming in the background. Waiting. The metal door slid open with a screech that seemed to last forever. Ronnie stepped inside. The cell was barely 6 feet wide. Concrete walls, a single bunk, a stainless steel toilet in the corner bolted to the floor like an anchor. The door slammed shut behind him. He lifted his arms and stretched them out. Both hands could touch the walls. I was 17, he would later say. And in that moment I felt smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. That cell unit C row 43 would be his world. 23 hours a day. 1 hour of light when he'd pace in an empty caged yard, eyes fixed on a sky that never seemed to change. Death row wasn't quiet. It had a sound, a pulse. The clank of chains, the buzz of electric doors, the coughs and screams of men who hadn't seen their mothers in years. The prayers of those who knew their date was coming. Ronnie didn't scream. He didn't fight. Not outwardly. He watched. He learned to breathe smaller, to eat slowly, to listen for footsteps. But it wasn't the noise or the bars that haunted him most. It was why. A year later, the state began transferring some inmates off death row into general population prisoners whose sentences had been converted to life without parole after the Supreme Court struck down Ohio's death penalty statute. Ronnie's name was on the list. Wee's wasn't. The morning of the transfer, Ronnie stood just outside his cell. Across the tier, Y stood behind his own bars, silent. They made eye contact. The younger brother. The older brother. The only two people who knew exactly what it meant to lose a lifetime before it even began. The guard said, "Let's move." Ronnie hesitated. Y stepped forward, put his hand through the bars, his voice low. "Go ahead, boy. I'll be all right." Ronnie didn't speak. He took his brother's hand, squeezed once, then turned away, walked the long corridor with guards on either side. Behind him, Y was already disappearing into shadow. Ronnie vowed that day, "One thing, I swear to God, I'll make it right for you." General population was no sanctuary. It was violence without rules. Ricky got stabbed over a breakfast tray. A man was strangled in the shower for owing cigarettes. The safest men were the ones who served barbers' kitchen hands, chapel cleaners. Ricky became the gardener. In a corner of the yard, he started planting roses. Not for anyone, not as a statement. Just because something about watching a flower bloom in the filth of that place made him feel less dead. Ronnie now Kwame found a different path. He began reading. Islam, philosophy. Prison books passed from hand to hand. The Quran gave him structure, stillness. He changed his name Kwame Ajamu, a name that meant he who fights fiercely for what he wants. He shaved his head, began fasting, found discipline in routine. He wrote letters to the court, to journalists, to anyone who might listen. Most never responded, but some did. In the early 80s, a few students at a Cleveland college wrote back. They visited once, then again. He spoke softly but with force. He began teaching other inmates how to write parole statements, taught literacy classes in the chapel. When a younger inmate collapsed from a panic attack, Kwame sat beside him in silence, just breathing. Meanwhile, Y was breaking. He began talking to shadows, lashing out during count, hitting the walls of his cell until his knuckles bled. The guards put him in solitary for stretches of months. Prison doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. He began losing time, forgetting faces. In group therapy, he once said, "My mom's voice is in the walls. She tells me I don't belong here." His mother had died 2 years earlier. The prison chaplain told him in a hallway casually, like a weather update. Y didn't cry, just stood there, then turned and walked straight into the wall. He didn't speak for 3 weeks. The pain inside him didn't scream. It whispered. It broke in silence. And then somewhere beyond those walls, in the world that had long forgotten them, Eddie Vernon was falling apart too. He was no longer the boy in clean school clothes. He was a teenager now. Quiet, withdrawn, avoiding eye contact. The guilt followed him like a shadow that never rested. He started drinking, then smoking weed, then pills, then cocaine. At night, he'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering the look on Ricky's face as they took him away. The sound of Ronnie's mother collapsing. The way Y never looked away, not even when the cuffs clicked shut. He hated himself. But not enough to confess. Not yet. So he drowned instead. He got arrested twice for shoplifting. Was expelled from school for fighting. Spent 3 nights in juvie. Told his mother he was just going through a phase. Told his friends he didn't remember much about that day. But he remembered everything. In moments of silence, it echoed what he'd said, what he hadn't done. I saw them do it. He'd told the lie once. But it was living with it that was killing him. By 1985, Kwame was teaching English grammar to inmates who'd never graduated. Ricky was growing orchids in plastic milk cartons. Y was in a locked psych unit speaking to a woman no one else could see. And Eddie Vernon was sitting alone in a park, a bottle in his hand, a scream in his throat he couldn't force out. Death row hadn't killed any of the boys yet. But the truth was, it already had. It began in the back row of a tiny church in Cleveland, where the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the pews still bore the carvings of hands long gone. Eddie Vernon sat there quiet, unmoving, in a borrowed jacket that didn't quite fit. His eyes were locked on the stained glass window above the pulpit. He hadn't come for God. Not exactly. He'd come because there was nowhere left to go. The man on the stage wasn't preaching fire and brimstone. His name was Pastor Anthony Singleton. His voice was calm, warm. He spoke not of judgment, but of release, of truth, of weight. Some of us in this room, he said, are carrying things we were never meant to carry alone. Eddie flinched. Just slightly, his hands clenched on his knees. After the service, he didn't speak. Not that day. He slipped out the side door unnoticed. But he came back. Sunday after Sunday, sitting in the same spot, same jacket. He listened. He prayed sometimes. Not with words, but with silence. And one evening, when the church was nearly empty and Pastor Singleton was locking up, Eddie lingered. "Pastor," he said, voice hoarse, "can I talk to you?" They sat in the third pew from the front. For a long time, Eddie didn't say anything. Then he did. "I lied," he whispered. "I lied to the police. About those men. About the murder." The pastor didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He just looked at Eddie the way a father might look at a lost child. Eddie's eyes welled up. His voice broke. "I was 12. I didn't know what I was doing. They yelled at me, said they'd take my parents away. I was scared. I didn't mean for them to die in there." His hands trembled. Pastor Singleton placed a hand over them. "You've held that alone for too long," he said softly. "But this is not where your story has to end." In the weeks that followed, Eddie returned often. Not just for services, but to talk, to cry, to sit in silence. He began helping out, sweeping the floors, folding bulletins, watching over the younger kids during Sunday school. The darkness in him didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip, until one day, everything changed. It was November 2001. Eddie was working security and intake at the City Mission halfway house, a long way from the boy who once stared out a school bus window. That day, a new arrival stepped in. Tall, weathered, quiet. Eddie looked up, took the man's ID, and froze. The name Wikel Bridgman. Eddie's breath caught in his throat. His vision swam. It couldn't be, but it was. Why look different, thinner, older, tired in a way that didn't just come from years? But the eyes were the same. Eddie panicked. He thought he might vomit, or run, or die. This man he'd helped send to prison was now standing right in front of him, unaware. He didn't recognize Eddie, and that made it worse. Eddie stood behind the intake desk, heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal. He should have stayed silent, let it pass, pretend he was someone else, but he didn't. As Y moved to join the others for breakfast, Eddie followed him, hands shaking. He tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me," he said. You don't know me, but my name is Edward. Edward Vernon." Y turned, looked him full in the face, and something flickered. A moment, a pause. Then Y smiled. Not with his mouth, but his eyes. "I remember you," he said. Eddie's voice cracked. "I'm sorry, I am so sorry." He didn't get further. The tears came first. He crumpled. Y caught him, and for a long, breathless moment, they stood in the hallway of that halfway house. Two men, one broken by guilt, the other by time, holding each other like brothers in a war they never chose. They cried, openly, ugly. Deep cries from the ribs, from the stomach, from the years. When Eddie finally pulled back, Y was the one smiling now. "It's not over," he said. "We can fix this." But Eddie's face changed. "No," he said. "No, I'm not ready." Y's brow furrowed. Eddie looked over his shoulder, lowered his voice. "I don't know what they'll do if I come forward. I don't want to go to jail. I can't." And just like that, the moment so full of hope slipped away. In the weeks that followed, Eddie didn't return to church. He didn't call the pastor, didn't go back to City Mission. He disappeared. No note, no explanation, no goodbye. Y waited. 3 days, a week, then 2. But Eddie never came back. Pastor Singleton drove around looking for him, stopping by the old boarding house, the store where Eddie used to work, phoning every contact he had. Every time he got the same reply: "He doesn't live here anymore." No idea where he went. Haven't seen him in weeks. Winter came. Snow settled on the stone steps of the church. The pews felt colder than usual. The pastor kept preaching about truth, courage, redemption. But Eddie's eyes were no longer in the crowd. Once again, the truth went silent. Y returned to prison. The halfway house was temporary. When the prison transport rolled out, taking him back to the main correctional facility, no one on that bus knew that just days earlier, Wikel Bridgman had stood face to face with the truth he'd waited decades to see. Back in his old cell, he didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't read. He just lay on his back, eyes open, staring at the cracked ceiling above him like it held some answer. He had forgiven, but that didn't erase the hollow ache inside. In an old notebook, one entry appeared in faded ink. "Hope can visit you for 3 minutes and leave you empty for 30 years. As for Eddie, he returned to silence. No one knew where he'd gone. Those who had seen him at church at the halfway house now spoke of him like a ghost. Edward Vernon, yeah, he used to come around. Then he just vanished. A social worker who had once counseled him said, "Some people spend their whole lives standing next to one moment they can't bring themselves to face. And that moment becomes their prison." Eddie had come so close. He'd stood at the edge of the truth, held the man whose life he helped destroy, and then he turned away. Not out of malice, but fear. Because he wasn't ready to bear the weight of what honesty would cost. And so the darkness closed again. The story remained imprisoned. Not in a courtroom, but in the soul of a man who once had the power to set 3 spirits free. It was a Tuesday afternoon in August when a young journalist named Kyle Swenson walked into a Starbucks on the east side of Cleveland. He was 24, fresh out of college, still wore his press badge clipped to his belt like it meant something. He was there to meet Kwame Ajamu, not because he was chasing a big story, not yet. It started with curiosity. A tip from an old professor. A mention of a man wrongly convicted. Just a blip on his radar. But the moment Kyle shook Kwame's hand, everything changed. Kwame didn't speak like a prisoner. He spoke like a professor. His sentences full of weight. His eyes calm, deliberate. They sat in the corner booth for hours. Kyle scribbled notes, nodding, pausing, asking. There was something about the man's presence, something that felt unfinished. Like a book missing its last chapter. And so Kyle did what young journalists do best. He started digging. He pulled the case files, dozens of them. Yellowing folders, brittle pages, court transcripts, witness lists, police statements. The more he read, the more it didn't make sense. There was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon ever recovered. Just one boy's testimony, Eddie Vernon. Kyle followed the paper trail. Tracked down every name in the files. Retired officers, former clerks. The defense attorney who'd represented Ronnie Bridgman in 1976. He remembered the case like it happened last week. It was rushed, he said. There was pressure. Nobody wanted to hear doubts. The jury wanted it wrapped up. Kyle found an old index card tucked into a box labeled Secondary Witnesses. On it, the name of a woman, then 16 years old. Deirdre Hall. She was alive. Still in Cleveland. Still rode the same bus route. When Kyle knocked on her door, she opened it in silence. Wore reading glasses and a long sweater. Listened quietly as Kyle explained who he was. Then she nodded. I was on the bus that day, she said. Same row as Eddie Vernon. Kyle held his breath, and she shook her head. There's no way he saw what happened. No way. That bus was stopped 2 blocks away. We didn't even know someone had been shot until the sirens came. Eddie was staring at his shoes the whole time. Kyle's pulse kicked up. He knew what this meant. If Eddie Vernon couldn't have seen the murder, his entire testimony collapsed. But that wasn't all. As he kept digging, Kyle found something that made his skin crawl. An old FBI memo buried in a 1975 interagency report shared with Cleveland police but never submitted to court. The memo described a robbery in Cincinnati. 2 suspects, armed. Same description as the attackers in the Harry Franks murder. Same pattern acid pistol money orders. The men had struck 2 weeks earlier, were known to be moving through Ohio. The memo ended with a blunt line. Possibility high suspects may be connected to East Cleveland homicide. Advised local investigators to coordinate. They never did. Kyle double-checked the date. The memo had arrived 2 days before Ronnie, Ricky, and Y were arrested. The Cleveland detectives ignored it. No follow-up, no comparison of suspect sketches, no evidence presented to the grand jury, nothing. Instead, 3 black teenagers were dragged into a courtroom, and a 12-year-old boy became the foundation of a death sentence. Kyle Swenson sat in his apartment that night, files spread across the floor, his laptop glowing in the dark. He stared at the photo of Wichelle Bridgman, taken at booking 1975. Then at the man he'd seen last week in the halfway house. 30 years gone. He thought of Kwame Ajamu's voice in the cafe. The truth never dies, man. It just waits for someone with guts to come get it. And then Kyle made a decision. He was going to get it. He wasn't sure how, or how long it would take, or what walls he'd have to knock down. But he knew in his gut this wasn't just a story. It was a wound, still bleeding, and someone had to open it up before it got buried for good. It was a Tuesday. Gray skies. Fluorescent lights buzzing above a Cleveland hospital bed that smelled like bleach and old paper towels. Eddie Vernon was dying. High blood pressure. Complications. Years of drinking and denial catching up with him in a body that couldn't outrun the past anymore. He was 52. Looked 70. Tubes in his arms. Machines humming like a metronome, counting down the last pages of a story that had waited decades to be rewritten. And on that day, he couldn't run anymore. Pastor Singleton sat beside him holding a worn Bible. Not reading, just waiting. Eddie's eyes fluttered open, his voice barely audible. "I can't die with this lie." Pastor leaned in. "Are you sure?" Eddie nodded, slowly. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, but never fell. "I lied," he whispered. "Back then, I lied about those boys. They didn't do it." The pastor didn't speak, just took his hand and gave it a squeeze. "They told me if I didn't say it was them, they'd take my mom and dad away. Said I was going to go to juvie. I didn't know what to do." The voice cracked. His hand shook. He whispered it again, slower this time. "I lied." And that was the moment, the turning point in a story full of sharp turns and dead ends. The recantation, the official sworn reversal, was recorded with a notary 2 days later, just in time. Eddie, still in the hospital bed, gave his statement, paused for breath, signed his name with a trembling hand, admitted the truth that he'd been coerced, threatened, broken. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect absolution. He just wanted to finally tell the truth. When the Innocence Project team received the affidavit, the room fell silent. Then movement fast-focused. Phone calls, briefings, boxes pulled from shelves, years of quiet investigation now catching fire. Kyle Swenson was the first to call Ricky Jackson. The line clicked. Ricky answered, standing outside the workshop where he volunteered part-time, his voice calm, routine. "Kyle," Eddie recanted. Kyle said. There was silence. Then the sound of something hitting the ground. It was Ricky's phone. He had dropped it. He bent down, picked it up, his hands trembling. "Say that again," he said, voice barely more than air. "Eddie." He admitted it. "It's on record. He said you didn't do it. None of you did." Ricky turned his face away from the street. He was crying. Not the loud kind. The kind that burns quietly through a man's bones. All those years, all that silence, and now this. He didn't say thank you. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He just stood there, the phone to his ear, as a whole life shifted beneath his feet. In Columbus, the Innocence Project team assembled. Young lawyers, old files, coffee cups, determined eyes. They knew what was ahead. This wouldn't be a celebration. It would be war. They'd have to stand in front of the very same system that had tried to erase 3 men. They'd have to argue not just innocence, but failure, neglect, abuse of power. They pulled case law, compared dates, built timelines, practiced arguments, rehearsed with witnesses. One intern fresh out of law school looked up and said, "They're going to fight us hard, aren't they?" The lead counsel, a woman who'd overturned 6 wrongful convictions in 5 years, nodded once. They always do. Outside the courthouse that morning, the pavement was slick with rain. Reporters gathered. So did ghosts. Inside, Ricky, Kwame, and Y sat at the defense table again. Decades older, decades wiser, decades heavier. But this time they had truth on their side, and the words of a man who, from a hospital bed, finally found the courage to set things right. The courtroom was silent. No shuffling, no whispers. Just the creak of the wooden benches and the distant ticking of a wall clock that seemed far too loud. Then the door opened. Edward Vernon stepped inside. He was no longer the wide-eyed boy from 1975. He was a man now graying heavier, slow. But he looked smaller than he should have. Like time had peeled something off him that would never come back. His hands trembled as he walked to the stand. All eyes were on him. The defense table, the gallery, the judge. And seated side by side, the men he had helped condemn, Ricky Jackson, Kwame Ajamawikile Bridgman. He didn't look at them. He couldn't. When he raised his hand and took the oath, his voice cracked. "I do," the prosecutor asked gently. "Mr. Vernon, do you remember what you told the court in 1975? He nodded, swallowed. "I said I saw the shooting, that it was them, Ricky Y. and Ronnie. And was that true?" A pause, silence heavy enough to break ribs. Then he looked up. Straight ahead. "No," he said, "it wasn't. I lied. Because I was scared. Because the police said bad things would happen to my parents if I didn't. I was 12. I didn't know what would happen. I thought I was doing what they wanted." A murmur rippled through the room. But Edward kept going. "I've lived with this my whole life, and I am sorry. Not just for the years you lost, but for the fear and the pain, and for not being brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered." He sat back down, hands folded, head lowered. The judge nodded, quiet, grave. Then the door on the other side opened. Prosecutor Tim McGinty entered the room, briefcase in hand, tie. Slightly loosened eyes, heavy. He approached the bench and said words no one expected to hear, at least not in a courtroom like this. "Your Honor, the state of Ohio recognizes the wrongful convictions of these men. After a full review of the evidence, and in light of Mr. Vernon's recantation, we withdraw all charges. The prosecution will not pursue further action." No objection, no challenge, just release. The judge turned to the three men at the defense table. "Mr. Jackson, Mr. Ajamu, Mr. Bridgman, this court vacates your convictions in full. You are hereby declared innocent." The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. Ricky covered his face with both hands. Kwame looked to the ceiling, mouthing a silent prayer. Y let out a breath he'd been holding for 39 years. There were no cheers, no music, just the soft sound of old men crying. They stood together, arms linked, not out of ceremony, but out of instinct. After 4 decades, they weren't just free. They were finally believed. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, the truth stood tall inside a courtroom. Outside the courthouse, the sky was pale blue, quiet, calm, almost weightless. The kind of day that didn't feel like a victory, but something softer. Like breathing after too long underwater. Ricky stood near the steps, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes scanning the crowd, but not really seeing it. Then he saw him. Eddie, older, smaller, walking with the help of a cane. He looked like a man made of paper, blown thin by years of guilt and silence. But he walked toward Ricky anyway. They stood face to face. No cameras, no speeches. Just 2 men, one broken by memory, the other by time. Eddie's voice was a whisper, "I didn't think you'd want to see me." Ricky looked at him for a long second. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around him. A full, shaking human embrace. "I forgive you," Ricky said, voice cracking. Eddie held on tighter. "But I haven't forgiven myself." They stayed like that for a moment that held 40 years inside it. A crowd watched in silence. Forgiveness, when it finally arrives, doesn't announce itself. It just takes root in the middle of pain and grows there. Later, as the sun dipped low, the 3 men stood side by side on the courthouse steps, Ricky, Jackson, Kwame, Ajamu, Bridgman. Their suits were simple, their expressions quiet. They didn't wave. They didn't cheer. They just took each other's hands and smiled, not because the past was gone, not because justice had finally caught up, but because, despite everything, they were still here, alive, whole, believed. The narrator's voice came gently. 1 boy, 1 lie. Nearly 40 years taken. But truth doesn't age, and hope never forgets how to wait. The screen faded to black as their silhouettes stood against the golden afternoon, framed in the soft light of something not quite justice, but something very close to peace. Freedom wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of what they had been denied, a life worth living.